Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the Boston Tea Party
Ooh.
and really the road to revolution in colonial America.
Yeah.
We're going to be using this podcast by, what's his name, Tom Holland
I'm Holland, yeah.
and Dominic Sandbrook.
Yeah.
They had a historian, Adam Smith, on. I
Yeah.
think it was like a Rest is History episode or something like that.
Right.
So we're going to kind of dive into that.
Right.
So picture this. It's 1773. You're in a tavern in Boston
Yeah.
having some ale, right? Maybe it's a little bit cold outside, so you're inside warming up by the fire.
Right.
But everyone's kind of tense and on edge,
Yeah.
and they're all talking about this new law that the British Parliament just passed called the Tea Act.
Right.
And this act is affecting everyone's livelihood because, of course, everyone drinks tea.
Right.
It's also just making them feel like they don't have any freedom.
Yeah.
You know, the colonists are not represented in the British Parliament.
Right.
So they don't have any say in these laws that are being passed.
Right.
And this is really the world that we're talking about.
Yeah.
The world on the brink of the American Revolution.
Yeah. And I think it's fascinating that on the surface, the Tea Act wasn't meant to punish the colonies or anything like that. It was really intended to help out the East India Company, which was really struggling financially at that time.
Yeah, so on the surface, the British government thought they were doing everyone a favor.
Right.
Like, oh, we're going to help out this company. And by the way, colonists,
Yeah.
you're going to get cheaper tea because we're cutting out all those middlemen,
Exactly. Yeah.
all those smugglers.
Yeah.
But obviously it wasn't that simple.
No, the colonists saw right through it.
Right.
They saw it as just a way for the British government to exert more control over them
Right.
and to really understand their outrage. We have to understand the context here.
Right.
For years, tensions had been brewing between Great Britain and the colonies.
Yeah, over taxes mostly. Right.
Exactly, over taxation without representation. Right.
The colonists felt like they were being treated like second-class citizens.
Right.
And they had already started boycotting British goods in protest.
Right.
But the Tea Act just threw gasoline on the fire.
Yeah, and to them, this was a violation of their rights as Englishmen.
Absolutely.
You know, they had this idea of English liberties
Yeah.
that they inherited from their forefathers.
Right.
And this act just completely ignored those liberties.
Exactly. So it wasn't just about the price of tea.
Right.
It was about this fundamental principle of self-government.
Right.
They felt like they had a right to have a say in the laws that govern them.
Right.
And the Tea Act was just the latest example of the British government ignoring that, right?
Right. So this brings us to a pretty pivotal moment. November 28, 1773. The Dartmouth,
The Dartmouth.
the first tea ship, arrives in Boston Harbor. What
That's-
happens?
Well, the colonists, they refused to let them unload the tea.
Wow.
Yeah, and this leads to a standoff
Wow.
for weeks.
weeks.
Yeah, just imagine the tension in Boston,
Yeah.
people milling about in the streets,
Right.
wondering what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Is this the breaking point?
Right.
And then on December 16th, 1773,
Okay.
history happens.
Right.
A group of colonists,
Okay.
disguised as Native Americans,
Yeah.
they board the tea ships
Okay.
and they dump over 340 chests of tea,
Wow.
worth thousands of pounds,
Wow.
into Boston Harbor.
That's a pretty dramatic statement.
It's an incredible act of defiance,
Yeah.
and it really captures the frustration and the anger that the colonists were feeling.
Right. It's not just a protest, it's a message.
Absolutely.
You know, we are not going to stand for this.
Yeah, this is where we draw the line.
Yeah.
You're not going to treat us this way. We're
Right.
going to fight back.
Right. And this became known as the Boston Tea Party,
The Boston Tea Party.
which everyone listening probably already knew,
Right.
but it's really a turning point
A major turning point.
and the relationship between Great Britain and the colonies.
It really is.
Yeah. It's the moment when colonial frustration boils over into direct action,
Yeah.
and it becomes a symbol of resistance around the world.
Right. But it's interesting to note that not everyone was on board with this.
Right.
Even among the colonists.
Yeah.
Benjamin Franklin, for example.
Yeah.
He actually condemned the Tea Party.
He did.
He thought it was too violent.
Great.
He was advocating for a more peaceful solution.
Yeah, he thought it was a step too far.
Right.
He thought it would just provoke the British and
Right.
lead to more conflict.
Right. So even within the colonies, there were these divisions.
Exactly. There was no single unified response.
Right.
Some people were ready to fight.
Right.
Some people wanted to negotiate. It was a
Yeah.
very complex situation.
Yeah. So you have these groups like the Sons of Liberty.
Right. The Sons of Liberty.
Yeah. Who are actively organizing protests and spreading the word about British injustices.
Yeah, they're the ones who are really pushing for action.
Right.
They're the ones who are saying, we need to stand up to the British. We need to fight for our rights.
Right. And then you have people like Franklin
Yeah.
who are saying,
Uh.
oh, okay, maybe we need to pump the brakes a little bit.
Right.
Let's not get too crazy.
Yeah, let's try to find a peaceful solution.
Right. But that was obviously not going to happen.
Well, the British response to the Tea Party made that pretty clear.
Right. They were not going to back down.
No, they weren't.
They passed a series of laws called the Coercive Acts.
The coercive acts were the intolerable acts, as the colonists called them.
Right.
Yeah.
And these were designed to punish Massachusetts
Absolutely.
for the Tea Party.
They closed the port of Boston.
Wow.
They restricted town meetings.
Okay.
They allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried in England
Wow.
instead of in the colonies.
So they're really cracking down.
Yeah, they're basically saying, we're in charge.
Yeah.
You're going to follow our rules or else.
And this really pushed the colonists closer to rebellion
Absolutely.
because it felt like a direct attack on their freedoms.
It was a direct attack on their freedoms, and
Yeah.
it really backfired on the British.
Because it just made the colonists more determined to resist.
Exactly. It just solidified their opposition.
Right.
And as if that wasn't enough.
Okay.
The British also passed the Quebec Act in 1774.
Okay, the Quebec Act.
Yeah.
So how does that fit into all of this?
Well, on the surface, it seems unrelated, but it actually played a big role in escalating tensions.
Okay.
For one thing, it expanded the boundaries of Quebec southward
Okay.
into territory that was claimed by several colonies.
Right.
So now the conflict wasn't just about taxes and representation.
Right.
It was also about land
Yeah.
and who controlled it.
Right.
And then there's the religious aspect of the Quebec Act.
Right.
It granted religious freedom to French Catholics.
Okay.
Now, remember, most of the colonists were Protestant,
Right.
and they had this long-standing distrust of Catholicism.
Right. Going all the way back to the Reformation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they saw this act as a threat to their religious liberty.
Wow. So now you have religious tensions on top of everything else.
Exactly.
Political tensions, economic tensions.
Powder keg.
Yeah. And to make matters worse, the British started stockpiling weapons in Ireland
Yeah.
because they were worried that the unrest in the colonies might spread.
Right.
So this just added to the paranoia.
Absolutely.
The colonists felt like they were being surrounded by enemies.
They felt like the British were preparing for war.
Right. And by September 1774, the situation had reached a boiling point.
Yeah.
Representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies,
All except Georgia.
right, met in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress.
The First Continental Congress.
This is a big deal
a huge deal.
because for the first time, the colonies are coming together
Right.
to coordinate their resistance to British rule.
Yeah. They're starting to act like a united front.
So are they ready for war at this point?
Well, not quite,
Okay.
but they take some pretty significant steps. They endorse something called the Suffolk Resolves.
Okay, the Suffolk Resolves?
Yeah.
What are those?
It's a series of resolutions that basically condemn the intolerable acts.
Okay.
They encourage colonists to stockpile weapons,
Wow.
and they call for continued boycotts of British goods.
So they're preparing for the possibility of war?
They're not ruling it out.
Right.
They're saying, if it comes to that, we're ready.
Right.
And this is a direct challenge to British authority.
Right.
They're basically saying, we're not going to back down.
Yeah.
We're going to fight for our rights.
But the British still think they can contain this to Massachusetts.
Yeah, they really underestimate the depth of the resentment in the colonies.
Right.
And they underestimate the growing sense of unity among the colonies.
Right.
They think they can just punish Massachusetts
Yeah.
and the other colonies will fall in line.
Right. But they're wrong.
Oh, they're very wrong.
Yeah. And this is when figures like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson start to become really influential.
Yeah, they're the ones who are articulating the colonists' desire for greater autonomy.
Right.
They're the ones who are saying we don't want to be ruled by a king.
Right.
We want to govern ourselves.
So they're basically laying the intellectual groundwork for the revolution.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're providing the ideas,
Right.
the arguments
Well-
that will justify the revolution.
So we've got rising tensions. We've got coordinated resistance.
Yeah.
We've got influential voices calling for change.
Right.
What happens next?
Well, this is where things start to get really serious.
Okay.
Militias, which had always been a part of colonial life,
Right.
start to become more organized,
Okay.
more prepared for war.
Okay. So the stage is set.
The stage is set.
The players are in position.
Right.
And the fuse is lit.
The fuse is lit. What?
Okay. So we left off with the colonies on the brink of war. Militias are mobilizing. Tensions are high. And everyone's kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Yeah.
So what happens next? Do those early skirmishes actually escalate into a full-blown conflict?
Oh, they absolutely do. In April 1775, The shot heard round the world rang out at the battles of Lexington and Concord.
Oh.
And these battles, although they were pretty small in scale, they really marked the beginning of the Revolutionary War.
Right. They're very symbolic.
Yeah, very symbolic.
Okay, so these battles, they're often portrayed as these kind of spontaneous clashes, right?
Yeah.
But, I mean, was there like a strategy behind them? Like, what were the British hoping to achieve?
Well, the British had gotten some intelligence that the colonists were stockpiling weapons in Concord.
Okay.
So their goal was to seize those weapons and basically disrupt the rebellion before it could really get going.
Right, like a show of force.
Yeah, they thought that if they could show the colonists who was really in charge, that they could nip this whole thing in the bud.
Oh, but, I mean, how did that work out for them?
Not very well. It actually backfired pretty spectacularly.
Okay. How so?
Well, it turns out the colonists were ready for them, thanks to writers like Paul Revere, who warned them that the British were coming.
Right.
The battles themselves were pretty chaotic and bloody, and in the end, the British were forced to retreat back to Boston.
So, not exactly the decisive victory they were hoping for.
No, not at all. And I think these early encounters really exposed some of the challenges the British were going to face.
What kind of challenges?
Well, first of all, they were fighting a war across a vast ocean.
Yeah.
Thousands of miles away from home.
Yeah.
It was really difficult to get supplies and reinforcements.
Right.
And then there was the terrain.
Yeah.
The American wilderness was very different from the battlefields of Europe. It was dense and forested with lots of places for the colonists to hide and ambush the British.
So it wasn't easy for the British to adapt to this new style of warfare.
No, it wasn't. And the colonists were very good at using the terrain to their advantage.
Right. It's like guerrilla warfare almost.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
They would hit and run. They would blend in with the civilian population.
Yeah.
It was very frustrating for the British.
So how did the British try to adapt? I mean, did they change their strategy at all?
They tried, but they were never really able to overcome these challenges.
Yeah.
They were just too used to fighting these traditional European wars, where you have two armies lining up and facing each other on an open battlefield.
Right, very formal.
Yeah, very formal.
Yeah.
But this was a very different kind of war.
Okay, so let's talk about the colonial side of things.
Okay.
How did their military organization evolve?
Well, at first, it was pretty chaotic.
Right.
The colonial forces were mostly made up of local militias, each with their own leaders and loyalties.
Yeah.
It wasn't a very unified force.
Right, but then obviously they had to come together at some point.
Yeah, as the war progressed, they realized that they needed a more centralized command structure if they were going to have any chance of defeating the British.
Okay, so how did that happen? Who emerged as the leader of the colonial forces?
Yeah. Well, in May 1775, just a month after the battles of Lexington and Concord, the Second Continental Congress met, and they took a very important step.
Okay, what did they do?
They established the Continental Army.
Okay.
And they appointed George Washington as its commander-in-chief.
George Washington, I mean, what a name.
Yeah. It's hard to imagine anyone else in that role,
Right.
but at the time he wasn't a household name.
Okay.
He had some military experience from the French and Indian War,
Right.
but he wasn't necessarily the obvious choice.
Okay, so what made him the right choice?
Well, he had a lot of qualities that made him a good leader.
Okay, like what?
He was known for his integrity,
Okay.
his courage,
Right.
his determination, and his commitment to the cause of liberty.
Yeah.
But maybe most importantly, he was a unifying figure.
Right.
He could bridge the divides between the different colonies and factions.
Right, so he was the guy who could bring everyone together.
Exactly.
And, I mean, let's be honest, that was no easy task.
No, it wasn't. He was basically tasked with taking this ragtag bunch of militias and turning them into a professional army that could stand up to the most powerful military force in the world.
Yeah, I mean, daunting is an understatement.
Yeah, it was a huge challenge, but he was up to it.
He was up to it.
He was a brilliant strategist
Right.
and an inspirational leader.
Okay, so we've talked about the military side of things, but I'm curious about how this war affected everyday life in the colonies.
Well, it affected everything.
Right.
Families were divided, economies were disrupted,
Right.
communities were transformed.
Right.
It was a time of tremendous upheaval and uncertainty.
Yeah, and how did the issue of slavery factor into all of this?
Yeah.
I mean, we talked about Lord Dunmore's proclamation offering freedom to slaves who joined the British.
Yeah, that was a really pivotal moment.
Yeah, how so?
Well, it exposed the hypocrisy at the heart of the American Revolution.
Right.
Here were these colonists fighting for their own freedom.
Right.
while at the same time denying freedom to an entire population within their own society.
It's a huge contradiction.
Yeah, and Dunmore's proclamation was very clever on the part of the British.
Right.
It was a way to exploit those divisions within colonial society
Right.
and potentially weaken the rebellion.
So how did the colonists respond to this challenge? I mean, did they grapple with the moral implications of fighting for liberty while still upholding slavery?
It was a really complex issue, and there wasn't a simple answer.
Right.
Some colonists, particularly in the North,
Okay.
started to question the morality of slavery,
Okay.
and abolitionist sentiment began to grow.
Okay.
But in the South, where the economy was heavily dependent on slave labor,
Right.
there was a lot of resistance to any talk of abolition.
Right.
So it was a very divisive issue.
Right. And it just added another layer of complexity to this whole situation.
Absolutely. The American Revolution was about so much more than just independence from Great Britain.
Right.
It was also about defining what it meant to be free and what it meant to be American.
And those are questions that we're still grappling with today.
Absolutely. The legacy of the American Revolution is still very much alive.
It's a very complex and nuanced legacy.
It is. And I think it's important to remember that.
Yeah, because it's easy to oversimplify it.
Yeah, it's easy to see it as this black and white struggle between good and evil.
Right.
But it was much more complicated than that.
Right. And I think that's what makes it so fascinating to study.
Absolutely. It's a period of history that's full of paradoxes and contradictions.
And there's still so much to learn from it.
I agree. And I think we're only just beginning to scratch the surface.
All right. So we've gone from that simmering resentment over taxes and tea all the way to those first shots fired at Lexington and Concord. It's been quite a journey.
It really has.
And now we arrive at, I guess, what you could call the point of no return, right? The move toward independence. But was it like a sudden thing, or was it more of a gradual evolution?
You know, it was kind of both, actually. I mean, that desire for more autonomy had been growing for years, right? But that actual decision to declare independence, that was not a decision they took lightly.
Right, yeah.
It was a culmination of so many events, arguments, you know, and ultimately the belief that reconciliation with Great Britain was just not possible anymore.
Okay, so what were some of those turning points that kind of solidified this decision? Was there like one specific event that pushed them over the edge, or was it more of a process?
Well, there were several factors at play, the ongoing bloodshed, obviously, right? And you have that growing sense of unity among the colonies, and of course the arguments put forth by people like Thomas Paine in his pamphlet, Common Sense.
Oh, yeah, common sense. That was huge.
It was massive.
Right.
His words really resonated with the colonists. He was advocating for independence and republicanism, you know, and it really swayed public opinion toward a clean break with Great Britain.
Right. So common sense was like this catalyst that kind of crystallized everything they'd been feeling.
Exactly. It really shifted the conversation from trying to reconcile to demanding independence. And then, of course, you have the Declaration of Independence itself, drafted by Thomas Jefferson, adopted by the Continental Congress on July 4th, 1776.
Okay, the Declaration of Independence, it's such an iconic document, you know, symbol of liberty for so many people around the world. What made it so powerful?
Well, for one thing, it laid out a very clear and compelling case for separation from Great Britain. It articulated those principles of natural rights, popular sovereignty, you know, the right of revolution, those ideas that really resonated far beyond the colonies.
Right, and those principles, they weren't just like abstract ideals. They were directly tied to the colonists' experiences.
Absolutely.
The Declaration lists all these grievances against King George III and the British Parliament, all these specific examples of how they felt oppressed and unjustly treated.
Right, it wasn't just some philosophical treatise. It was a direct indictment of British rule. And it was incredibly effective at galvanizing support for the revolution.
Yeah, both at home and abroad. So speaking of abroad, how did other nations react to all this? Did the colonists get support from other world powers?
Oh, yeah, they did. France especially was eager to weaken its rival, Great Britain, so they provided a lot of financial and military support. And then Spain and the Netherlands joined the conflict, too.
Wow, so this little colonial uprising turned into this major international conflict.
It did, and the outcome of this war, it would reshape the geopolitical landscape and inspire revolutions all over the world.
I mean, that's incredible.
It really is.
Okay, so we've talked about the military and the political side of the revolution, but what about the social and cultural changes? Did the war transform American society in any lasting ways?
Oh, absolutely. The revolution unleashed all these new ideas about freedom, equality, and self-government. It spurred the growth of Republican ideals, and it led to the creation of new institutions and systems of government.
And were those changes limited to the elite, or did they filter down to ordinary people?
No, these changes affected everyone. The war touched the lives of men and women, farmers, merchants, enslaved people, free people. It was a period of both upheaval and opportunity.
Right. So it wasn't just about like who was in charge. It was about reshaping the very fabric of society.
Exactly. It sparked debates about the role of women in society, about the rights of minorities, the nature of a just and equitable government. It was a time of progress and struggle as different groups tried to figure out their place in this new nation.
Wow. So we've covered so much ground in this deep dive. We explored those early tensions, the key battles, the Declaration of Independence, the social and political changes that reshaped America. It's been quite a journey.
It has, and it's a journey that's still ongoing in many ways.
Right.
The legacy of the American Revolution is still something we're grappling with today.
Yeah. And I think that's what makes it so fascinating to study.
Absolutely. It challenges us to think critically about our own value, our own beliefs about freedom and equality and justice.
And that's where we'll leave our deep dive for today. But before we go, we want to leave you with one final thought. The American Revolution was a complex and multifaceted event full of contradictions and enduring legacies. So how do we as individuals and as a society continue to grapple with those complexities and strive to live up to those ideals of liberty and equality that were fought for so fiercely centuries ago?
That's the question we all need to ask ourselves. The American Revolution was just the beginning, the struggle to create a more perfect union. It's an ongoing process, one that requires vigilance, critical reflection, and a commitment to justice for all.
Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the American Revolution. And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the fascinating world of history.